My mother is tied to a rock under the hot sun. Please help her. The cowboy untied the Apache woman's ropes. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The afternoon sun in the Arizona territory did not forgive. Heat pressed down from every side, drawing sweat from the skin and leaving the mouth dry no matter how often one swallowed. The land stretched bare and open, patches of mesquite and brittle brush breaking the emptiness. Dust clung to the horizon like a faint haze that a single rider moved along a faint wagon track. His horse was lean and reliable, head bowed, nostrils flaring with every breath of hot air. The cowboy in the saddle was about 38, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face roughened by years outdoors and eyes that carried the weight of too many memories. His jaw was dark with stubble. His hat was battered and bent at the edges, and the long coat on his back bore scars of use, a sleeve frayed where a past fight had torn through. His name was not spoken often anymore. Once he had been a soldier during the war, infantry, then scout, trained to endure heat, hunger, and silence. He had watched friends fall, and he had carried orders he could not forget. When the war ended, he drifted. No family waited for him. No land called him home. He kept moving, riding trails that led nowhere, sleeping by fires that gave no comfort. His mission now was survival, day to day, mile to mile. He avoided towns, kept away from law and quarrel, carrying his grief like a companion he could not shake. On this day, he rode without purpose, his mind set on finding water before dusk. That was when a sudden shape broke the stillness ahead. A boy came running out from the brush, barefoot, his thin frame shaking with exhaustion. He looked no older than 8 or 9. His shirt hung loose and torn, and his chest heaved as if each breath might split him in two. The cowboy's horse jolted, and he pulled the reins hard, stopping just in time before trampling the child. The boy raised his arms in panic. "Please!" His voice cracked from dryness and fear. He bent forward, clutching his side, words spilling out broken and rushed. "My mother! Please! You must help. She's tied." The cowboy's eyes narrowed. Years of soldiering had taught him to weigh every word, every movement. Could this be a trick? Bandits sometimes used children to lure men into ambushes. But the boy's wide eyes and trembling hands told a story that no outlaw could fake. His fear was too raw, his voice too desperate. The cowboy dismounted, boots landing heavy on the dry ground. He crouched so his shadow fell over the boy, looking him straight in the eye. "Where?" His voice was rough, worn thin by long disuse. The boy's hand shot out, pointing back toward the scrub and rock behind him. His arm shook as though he was afraid the stranger would not believe him. "This way. They left her." His lips quivered, and his breath came ragged, as if he had run for miles. For a moment, the cowboy stood still, thinking. He could turn away. The woman was a stranger, and the trouble that came with townsfolk was not his concern. But the war had left him with one truth. Some things could not be ignored, not if a man wanted to keep the last piece of his soul intact. He gave a short nod and motioned for the boy to lead. They moved quickly across the dry earth, the boy stumbling now and then, but never stopping. The cowboy followed close, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of danger. His hand rested near the worn revolver on his belt, instinct sharp. The clearing came into view after a short climb. At its center stood a pale rock, bleached by years of sun. Against it, bound by rope, was a woman. The sight struck the cowboy harder than he expected. She was young, mid-20s at most, with bronze skin now reddened by the sun's burn. Her long black hair clung to her face, damp with sweat. Ropes bit into her wrists, deep lines carved into her flesh. Her deerskin dress was torn at the shoulder and hip, beadwork dulled with dust. Her head lolled forward, lips cracked, breath shallow and uneven. She looked half gone already, not from hours, but from the intent cruelty of whoever had left her there. The boy let out a broken cry and rushed forward. "Mama!" The cowboy followed at a steady stride, pulling his knife free. He worked at the ropes quickly, the blades slicing through rough fibers. The woman's arms fell limp, and she slumped against him before she could hit the ground. He caught her, the heat of her body alarming against his chest, so dry and weak it felt like she might slip away. He lifted her carefully, one arm under her knees, the other steadying her back. She was light, too light for a grown woman. The boy clung to his side as he carried her toward the shade of a mesquite tree on the edge of the clearing. There, he set her down gently, propping her against the trunk. The cowboy pulled the canteen from his belt, twisting the cap free. He held it to her lips. At first, she didn't respond, water spilling down her chin. He tilted it back, steady, until her cracked lips parted and she swallowed a few shallow gulps. Her eyelids fluttered open. For a moment, her dark eyes met his. They were clouded, fevered, but there was strength behind them, strength that had not been broken despite the cruelty she'd suffered. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The cowboy reached into his pack, pulling out a rag. He soaked it with water and pressed it gently against her wrists where the skin was raw and broken. She winced, but didn't pull away. The boy pressed himself close against her, whispering soft words in Apache that the cowboy couldn't understand, though the tone was clear. Comfort, reassurance, love. The cowboy worked in silence. He pulled a rough blanket from his horse's saddlebag and laid it over her shoulders. The fabric looked old and torn, but under the shade it gave her cover from the still burning sun. He crouched beside her. He thought about what he had just stepped into. Whoever had tied her there would not welcome a stranger's interference. He knew well enough what it meant to involve himself. Trouble had a way of following kindness out here. Still, as he looked at the boy's trembling hands clutching at his mother's dress and at the faint rise and fall of the woman's chest, he knew he would not walk away. His mission had been only to survive each day. Now, without words, that changed. He had taken them into his care the moment his knife cut the ropes. The cowboy adjusted his hat against the glare of the sun and settled onto one knee beside them. He would stay for now, long enough to see if the woman lived, long enough to keep the boy from being left alone in this cruel land that was a choice made in silence. But in his mind, it was final. The woman leaned back against the rough bark of the mesquite, her chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Her eyes were open now, but they shifted restlessly, as if the sun still blazed directly into them. The boy clung to her side, his hand gripping her arm tight, unwilling to let go even for a moment. The cowboy stayed crouched a few feet away, watching her with steady eyes, measuring every sign of her condition. He had seen men collapse from heat on long marches during the war, and he knew the signs. She was close to losing her body to the desert. He poured a little water onto the rag and dabbed it across her face, cooling the angry redness of her skin. The boy whispered to her in Apache, quick words carrying both fear and relief. The cowboy could not understand the language, but he could hear the desperation in the boy's tone. The woman's lips parted slightly, her dry voice rasping. Enough, no more water. She struggled with English, her words broken but clear enough. He nodded. Too much water at once would only make her sick. He had learned that lesson the hard way years ago. The cowboy's eyes flicked toward the clearing, toward the pale rock where she had been tied. His mind turned to the question any man would ask. Who had done this and why? It was not the work of bandits. Bandits would have taken what they wanted and left her in the dirt. This had the mark of townsfolk, punishment carried out with cruelty dressed up as justice. He wondered if she had been accused of stealing or if the town simply wanted to rid themselves of her presence. The truth didn't matter much to him now. She was alive, and he had cut her free. That choice bound him to whatever came next. The boy finally looked at the cowboy, his wide eyes wet and filled with fear. Will she live? His voice was small, but it held all the weight of the son who had already seen too much suffering. The cowboy didn't answer right away. He studied the woman's face, the shallow pull of her breath, the strength still lingering in the way she tried to sit straighter despite her weakness. At last he spoke. She's strong. She'll pull through. His voice was rough, but it carried a certainty that steadied the boy. The cowboy rose and walked to his horse, loosening the straps of his saddlebag. He pulled out a strip of dried meat and a small bundle of hard bread. He carried it back to the shade and set it down beside the woman. She looked at it, but didn't move. The boy's stomach growled softly, a sound the cowboy noticed though the boy tried to hide it. Without a word, he broke off a piece of bread, softened it with a little water, and handed it to the boy first. Then he gave another piece to the woman. Only when they had taken food did he eat a small portion himself. Questions hung in the silence, unspoken but heavy. Where had they come from? Why had the town chosen to punish her in such a way? Would the townsfolk come searching when they realized she had not died where they left her? The cowboy thought of all these things but did not press them. For now, survival came first: water, shade, and rest. The woman's hands trembled as she tried to lift the bread. He steadied it for her, without touching more than her wrist. She managed a bite, chewing slowly, her eyes lowering to the ground. She looked ashamed, though she had no reason to. He recognized the look. He had seen it on men humiliated by the war, stripped of dignity by forces beyond their control. He said nothing, but his steady presence beside her was answer enough. The sun began to dip lower, shadows stretching across the land. The cowboy knew they could not stay in the clearing. Shade here would vanish soon, and the rock where she had been tied was too close, too visible. Whoever left her might return. He stood, his tall frame cutting across the light, and glanced toward the canyon beyond the ridge. A stream ran there. He had passed it days before. If they could reach it, there would be water, cover, and better ground to rest on. That he crouched again, speaking directly to the woman. "We can't stay. There's water ahead. You walk." His words were few, spoken in the plain, clipped way of a man, and used a conversation. She met his eyes, silent for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Her pride would not let her admit weakness. That he helped her to her feet. Her legs buckled at first, but she steadied herself against the tree. The boy slipped under her arm, supporting her small weight with all the strength his young frame could muster. The cowboy stood close, ready to catch her if she fell. He placed the blanket across her shoulders again, shielding her from the cooling wind, now moving in from the west. They began the slow walk away from the clearing, leaving the pale rock behind. The cowboy led them toward the distant canyon, every step measured, every glance behind cautious. His mind worked through the questions that any listener might ask. Would the town hunt them down? Was the boy truly hers? And why had he, a man who swore to live only for himself, chosen to intervene? He had no easy answers. All he knew was that once he cut those ropes, there was no turning back. As the three figures moved into the growing shadow of the land, the cowboy's jaw tightened. For years, he had ridden with no mission but to stay alive. Now, against his will and without his consent, he had won: to see this woman and her boy safely through the night. The walk to the canyon was slow, the woman's steps uneven, her body weakened from the hours tied to the rock. The boy kept close, his small arm wrapped around her waist, as if his touch alone would keep her standing. The cowboy walked ahead, steady and silent, scanning the horizon every few moments. The desert had a way of carrying trouble across distances: dust trails, sudden riders, the faint sound of hooves, and he knew better than to trust the quiet. By the time they reached the canyon's edge, the sky had shifted to the deep red of evening, the sun sliding low. The cowboy led them down a narrow path carved into the rock, one hand ready on the woman's arm when the ground grew loose underfoot. She didn't speak, but he could feel the strain in her body as she forced herself to keep moving, her pride holding her upright, even when her strength threatened to give the bottom. A stream cut through the stone, the water clear and cool, shaded by cottonwoods that bent over the narrow bank. The boy gasped at the sight of it and rushed ahead, dropping to his knees to cup water into his mouth. The cowboy caught his shoulder sharply. "Slow, not too much." His voice was firm, carrying the edge of command that came from habit. The boy looked startled but obeyed, sipping carefully, glancing at the man as if trying to understand him. The woman lowered herself to the bank, her body trembling with fatigue. The cowboy knelt beside her, filling the canteen and offering it to her in measured turns. She drank in short gulps, pausing between each, her chest rising and falling with effort. He saw color begin to return to her face, faint but present. That "it" was then the boy spoke, his words quiet but steady, as though he had been holding them back since the moment they met. They said she stole bread from a store. His eyes lowered, shame burning in his small voice. She didn't. They just wanted her gone. The cowboy's jaw clenched. He had guessed as much, but hearing it confirmed stirred something inside him. Townsfolk liked to call it justice when they turned cruelty into punishment. He had seen it before, once with deserters, once with men who spoke against officers. They called it order, but what it left behind was broken flesh and broken dignity. He glanced at the woman, seeing the quiet pride in her expression, the way she refused to meet his eyes, even as her wrists still bled from the rope burns. He said nothing, because words would not change what had been done. Instead, he set about building a fire. He gathered branches, struck flint, and coaxed flame from dry kindling. The boy watched him closely, curiosity creeping through his fear, noting every careful movement of knife and steel. The woman leaned against a rock, her gaze fixed on the small firelight as though it were the first warmth she had known in weeks. When the flames rose steady, the cowboy pulled strips of dried meat from his saddlebag, letting them soften near the heat. He passed one to the boy, then to the woman, and only then ate himself. It was the same order as before. The boy noticed. He ate slowly, staring at the man, as if testing the meaning behind that choice. Night fell heavy over the canyon. Coyotes yipped somewhere far across the ridges. The cowboy fed more wood to the fire, his eyes sharp on the darkness, alert for movement. He had not forgotten the risk. Whoever had tied her to that rock might come searching, and if they followed the boy's tracks, they might find this canyon. He loosened the strap on his revolver and kept it within easy reach. The woman shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She finally spoke, her English halting, strained from disuse. "You why help?" The cowboy looked at her for a long moment. He could have said nothing, as he often did, but the question hung heavy. He thought of the war, of men he hadn't saved, of the boy now sleeping against his mother's side. At last, his reply came low and plain. "Because leaving you there would have made me no better than them." She held his gaze, her dark eyes steady despite the weakness in her body. Then she gave a single nod, saying no more. He knew she would not thank him. Not now, maybe not ever. She was too proud, and perhaps too wounded, for words like that. But in her silence, he felt no rejection. It was something closer to respect. The boy lay curled near the fire, exhaustion pulling him under. The woman's breathing grew slower, deeper, the faint lines of pain easing as rest finally came. The cowboy sat with his back to a rock, watching the fire burn low, his mind restless. He had spent years keeping to himself, avoiding attachments, because attachments meant loss. Yet here he was, with a woman barely clinging to life and a boy who already looked at him as if he were more than a stranger. The canyon was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the steady whisper of water in the stream. The cowboy shifted his coat tighter around him, the revolver resting close by. Sleep would not come easy. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. Tomorrow, they would need food, better shelter, and a plan. And whether he wanted it or not, he was no longer riding alone. Morning came slow in the canyon. The light crept down the rock walls, touching the stream first, then spilling toward the small camp the cowboy had set near the fire's ashes. The boy was already awake, crouched by the water, splashing his face and shaking off sleep. His shirt clung to him, damp, but he smiled faintly as if the coolness gave him a moment of freedom. The woman stirred under the blanket, her body stiff, her movements cautious. Her wrists, raw and swollen, drew her eyes with every shift of her hands. She turned them away quickly, ashamed of how broken they looked. The cowboy had been up before either of them, moving with quiet efficiency. He had set 2 snare traps further along the canyon and gathered dry wood for a new fire. Now he crouched near the stream, sharpening his knife on a flat stone. His coat hung open, shirt rolled at the sleeves, revealing arms marked with scars from both war and frontier life. The boy watched him with a mix of curiosity and caution, inching closer as if drawn by the steadiness in the man's every movement. The woman's voice, faint but firmer than the night before, broke the silence. "You soldier." She had noticed the way he carried himself, the alertness in his eyes, how his hand never strayed far from the revolver. The cowboy paused his work, considering. For a moment, it looked like he might let the question hang unanswered. But he met her eyes at last. Was. A long time ago. His tone was flat, clipped, but there was no denial. She studied him carefully, then lowered her gaze. She did not press further, but her son did. "Did you fight bad men?" The boy's question was simple, innocent, but made the cowboy's jaw tighten. Images returned uninvited. Faces of young men who never made a home. The crack of rifles, the smell of blood thick in the dirt. He swallowed, set the knife down, and answered carefully. "I fought. Some of them were bad. Some were just men, same as me." He looked at the boy directly, making sure he understood. No war leaves heroes, only survivors. The boy frowned, not fully grasping the weight of the words, but sensing the seriousness. He nodded and said no more. The woman glanced at the cowboy, something unreadable flickering in her expression. She had lived through her own kind of war, the cruelty of townsfolk, the constant fight to protect her child. She recognized in him the same weariness, the same scars that did not show on skin alone. Later, the cowboy checked the snares and returned with a rabbit. He cleaned it with practiced movements, his knife flashing steady. The boy leaned close, watching each cut, each careful motion of skinning and preparing the meat. The cowboy didn't speak, but after a time, he handed the boy the knife, guiding his hands with quiet patience. It was the first time the boy's face lit with something close to pride. The woman noticed, her eyes softening as she watched her son find strength in small lessons. As the meat cooked over the fire, the boy asked the question that had lingered since the clearing. Will they come back? The people who did this? His voice carried a tremor of fear, one that no child should have to carry. The cowboy didn't look away from the flames. Maybe. That's why we keep moving. His tone was matter of fact, but his hand tightened slightly around the handle of the pan. The woman shifted, pulling the blanket tighter. She had wondered the same, but had not dared to ask. Now she looked at him, waiting. He met her gaze, steady and serious. We'll head north. Canyon splits into pine country. More cover, more game. He spoke as if the choice had already been made, as if their safety was now his responsibility. The woman's lips parted, as if she wanted to ask why he cared, why he stayed. But she closed them again, swallowing the words. Part of her feared the answer. Another part feared that asking might break whatever fragile bond had begun forming. They ate slowly, the boy smiling faintly when the cowboy handed him the best piece of meat without hesitation. When the meal was done, the cowboy rose, adjusted the saddle on his horse, and looked back at them. You ride. I'll walk. His tone left no room for refusal. He had already decided. The boy helped his mother to the horse, steadying her as she climbed awkwardly into the saddle. The cowboy placed the boy behind her, tightening the blanket around them both. He gave the horses reins a light pat, then took his place at the front, boots crunching against the dirt path as he led them forward. The canyon walls rose high above them, the sound of water fading as they moved deeper. The woman's eyes lingered on the back of the man walking ahead, broad, steady, carrying the burden without complaint. She realized then that the question was no longer why he helped them. The question now was how far he was willing to go. The cowboy felt her eyes on him, but did not turn. He kept his gaze forward, scanning the land, every sense sharp. Inside, though, he wrestled with thoughts he had not allowed in years. He had sworn to live alone, to let no one close. Yet now he found himself guiding a woman and her son through country filled with danger. And though he would not say it, he knew already that leaving them was no longer an option. The trail out of the canyon rose sharply, winding through loose stone and brush. The cowboy walked ahead, leading the horse by its reins, his boots crunching against the gravel. Behind him, the woman sat upright in the saddle, her son holding tight around her waist. She swayed slightly with the horse's movement, her body still weak but steadier than the day before. Her eyes scanned the land with quiet wariness, the memory of her punishment lingering in every twitch of her hands as they gripped the blanket around her shoulders, be why midday the sun was high again, though the air grew cooler as they climbed. Pines appeared, sparse at first, then thicker, spreading shadows across the trail. The cowboy welcomed the cover. He knew the open desert left them exposed, easy to spot from far away. Here the trees offered concealment, though they also demanded alertness. Too many places for ambush. His gaze swept constantly from side to side, his ears tuned to every snap of branch and cry of bird. The boy shifted on the horse, frowning. Will they follow us? The townsman. His voice cracked with the same question he had asked the night before, but now it carried more weight. He wanted certainty, and certainty was hard to give. The cowboy stopped walking, turning to face them. His eyes met the boy's directly. Maybe, maybe not. But if they do, we'll be ready. His words were calm, spoken like fact, not reassurance. He had learned in war that false promises only bred despair when they broke. The boy studied him, then nodded slowly, as if absorbing the lesson. The woman spoke next, her voice rough but firmer than before. They will not forgive. They think I shamed them. I live near town on the edge. They said I took what was not mine. Bread, water. I did not. But they wanted me gone. She held his gaze now, daring him to judge her. The cowboy didn't flinch. He had suspected the truth already. Town justice, he muttered, the bitterness clear. He had seen it before, how a crowd's judgment could be harsher than law. Men and women could be cast out for nothing more than being different, being unwanted. He looked at her wrists, at the deep wounds still red from the ropes. You don't owe them a damn thing. His words struck something in her. For the first time since he had cut her free, she let out a slow breath that sounded almost like relief. Not thanks, not forgiveness, just a release of the weight she had been carrying alone. They pressed on until they reached a small clearing by a stream that cut through the trees. The cowboy stopped, tying the horse to a low branch. He crouched near the water, cupping it in his hands before drinking, then motioned for them to do the same. The boy scrambled down first, kneeling beside him. The woman followed, slower, steadying herself with one hand against the trunk of a pine. She bent to drink, the cold water washing dust and bitterness from her lips. The cowboy unpacked his gear, setting out dried beans, a small sack of flour, and what was left of the rabbit meat from the night before. He built a fire quickly, his movements efficient, practiced. The boy sat close, eyes wide, watching everything. The woman observed too, her silence no longer guarded but thoughtful, as though she was beginning to learn the pattern of his ways. When a meal was ready, the cowboy handed food to her first, then the boy, then himself. The boy frowned. Why do you always eat last? It was a child question, but an honest one. The cowboy looked at him, then at the woman, before answering. Because you too need it more. His voice was quiet, but there was finality in it. The boy didn't ask again. The woman studied him a long moment, her eyes holding an expression he couldn't quite read. Part respect, part curiosity, part something softer she kept hidden as dusk fell. The cowboy set a perimeter around the camp, marking tracks in the dirt, setting simple noise traps with stones and twine. The boy followed, asking what each trap was for. The cowboy explained in short, clipped answers, teaching him without fuss. The woman watched from the fire, her face lit by the glow, realizing that this stranger had already begun preparing them not just to survive, but to defend themselves if the need came. Later, when the boy had curled against the blanket and drifted into sleep, the woman spoke quietly, her voice low so as not to wake him. You had family once. The cowboy froze. His hand paused over the firewood he was stacking. He stared into the flames, the shadows shifting across his face. For a long while he didn't answer. When he did, his words were rough, stripped of emotion. A wife. She's gone. The woman didn't press further. She only nodded, understanding enough. She knew what it was to lose, though in a different way. She leaned back against the tree, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but softer now when they rested on him. The cowboy sat awake long after both mother and son slept. His revolver lay across his lap, his gaze fixed on the dark line of trees beyond the fire. He thought of the town, of the cruelty that had left her tied to a rock, of the men who might decide unfinished punishment was no punishment at all. He thought, too, of the boy, of the way he had already begun to look at him with a kind of trust he hadn't earned. For years he had carried no mission but his own survival. Tonight, he felt the weight of a new one pressing down on him. Unwelcome, unasked for, but impossible to set aside. He would keep them alive, and if the town came hunting, he would face it. The fire crackled, the night deepened, and for the first time in years, the cowboy's solitude was broken not by ghosts of the past, but by the breathing of the two souls asleep beside him. The forest was still when dawn broke, but the cowboy had not slept. He remained seated with his back against a pine, revolver in hand, his eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the camp. The fire had burned low to ash, its faint smoke curling upward in thin strands. The boy and his mother still slept, their breathing soft, but every shift in the wind kept him tense. He had lived too long on the edge to ignore the feeling in his gut, the sense that trouble was not far behind. When the boy stirred awake, rubbing his eyes, the cowboy motioned him quiet and pointed to the dirt a few yards out. Clear hoof prints cut across the soft ground. The boy's breath caught, his face pale. Someone had been near during the night. The cowboy rose, studying the tracks. 4, maybe 5 horses, moving slow, keeping low to the land. He didn't need to guess who they were. Townsfolk didn't like loose ends, and they sure as hell wouldn't forgive a stranger for cutting a woman free from the punishment they thought she deserved. He walked back to the camp, his expression grim. The woman was awake now, sitting with the blanket over her shoulders, watching him closely. She read the answer in his eyes before he spoke. "They're coming," she asked. Her voice was low, but steady. Even with the fear she tried to hide, he gave a short nod. "Not far. Maybe a day behind." The boy pressed himself against his mother, his small hand gripping hers tight. The cowboy crouched in front of them. "We can't stay here. We move." His tone left no room for debate. He began packing the supplies with quick, efficient movements, every sound sharp against the morning quiet. They made ready. The boy asked the question that had lingered unspoken since they left the rock. "Why are they so cruel? Why do they want her dead?" His voice broke, heavy with the weight no child should carry. The cowboy tightened the strap on his saddlebag before answering. "Fear. Hate. Sometimes men don't need more reason than that." He glanced at the boy, his gaze hard but honest. "That's the truth of it. But it doesn't mean we let them finish what they started. They set out north, climbing deeper into pine country where the ground was rougher and harder to track. The cowboy walked ahead, guiding the horse along narrow trails that wound between jagged boulders. His mind worked constantly. Routes, cover, how many bullets he carried, how many shots he could afford to waste. He had faced worse odds in the war, but this was different. Back then he fought for orders, for men beside him. Now he fought to keep 2 strangers alive, and that made the burden heavier. By midday, they reached a high ridge. The cowboy scanned the land below with squinted eyes. In the distance, faint dust clouds moved across the open ground. Riders slow but steady, heading north just as he expected. He felt the tightness in his chest confirm what his instincts had already told him. They were being tracked. He led them down the far side of the ridge, deeper in a thicker timber where the horses' hooves left fewer signs. When they stopped near a stream to rest, the woman turned to him, her voice low. "You could leave us. Safer for you." The words struck him harder than he let show. He stared at her, her wrists still raw, her face shadowed by exhaustion, but her eyes fierce with the dignity she had refused to let them steal. "Not my way," he said simply. His voice carried no grand promise, only certainty. The boy watched him, studying the man's face, trying to understand why someone with no blood tie would risk so much. It was a question many listening would have asked. Why this cowboy, broken by his own past, chose to stay. The answer showed, not in words, but in every decision he made. Keeping watch through the night, giving them food first, placing himself in the open while they rode sheltered. The boy nodded faintly to himself, as if the truth was enough, because this man had decided to protect them when no one else would be. Why late afternoon, storm clouds gathered over the mountains. Thunder rolled faint in the distance. The cowboy knew rain could be both curse and blessing. Muddy ground slowed travel, but it also washed away tracks. He urged the horse faster, guiding them toward a cluster of caves he remembered from his scouting years. Shelter was needed, and soon. The first drops fell as they reached the mouth of a shallow cave. The cowboy led them inside, checking the walls and ceiling with careful eyes before signaling it was safe enough to rest. He built a small fire near the entrance, just enough for warmth, but not enough for smoke to carry far. The boy huddled against his mother, who sat with her back to the stone, the blanket wrapped tight. As the rain beat hard outside, the woman finally spoke what had been burning since the start. "You said you had a wife. What happened?" The cowboy froze. The firelight cast shadows across his face, deepening the lines carved by years of silence. He stared into the flames, and for a long moment it seemed he would not answer. Then his voice came low, heavy with memory. "Fever took her. There was nothing to be done. I buried her by the creek where we lived." He stopped there. No need to say more. The weight of it filled the silence. The woman lowered her gaze, her hands tightening on the blanket. She knew grief, though in a different shape. The boy, sensing the heaviness, leaned closer in her side and said nothing. The storm raged on, the sound of rain masking the world beyond the cave. The cowboy sat near the entrance, revolver across his lap, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. He knew the riders were out there, somewhere in the rain, searching. But as he listened to the quiet breathing of the woman and her son behind him, he felt the decision harden in his chest. If the riders came, they would not pass without facing him first. The cave was cold, but the fire glowed steady. For the first time since this began, the boy lay down to sleep without fear written across his face. The woman's eyes closed slowly, exhaustion overtaking her, and the cowboy remained silent and unyielding, guarding them against the storm and whatever came after. The rain slowed by morning, though the ground outside the cave was slick and heavy with mud. Mist clung low between the trees, muffling sound, making every echo uncertain. The cowboy stepped out first, boots sinking in the softened earth, eyes scanning the ridgeline. He crouched low and touched the mud with 2 fingers. Fresh tracks. Horses had passed during the night, close, too close. He rose slowly, jaw tight, and returned inside. The woman was awake, sitting with her son still curled against her. She studied his face as he came in, reading the truth before he spoke. "They are near," she said quietly. "Closer than I'd like," he answered. He checked the revolver at his hip, then the rifle strapped to his saddle. Every round mattered now. He carried only enough for a fight he couldn't afford to lose. The boy stirred awake, rubbing his eyes. "Did they find us?" he asked, voice trembling. The cowboy crouched down, steadying his tone. "Not yet, but they will. You both need to be ready to move when I say." He didn't soften the words. He had learned children understood more than most men gave them credit for. And the boy nodded, his small face tightening with determination he had no right to bear at his age. They broke camp quickly. The woman helped as best she could, though her wrists still bore the deep red grooves of rope, and her body weakened faster than she allowed herself to show. She caught the cowboy watching her and straightened her back, her pride unwilling to let him see her falter. They set out along a narrow deer path that wound uphill into thicker timber. The cowboy led the horse, keeping his head low, every sense straining. His mind ran through the questions anyone watching their journey would ask. What would happen when the riders caught up? Would he fight them outright? Or would he try to slip past unseen? Could he protect both the woman and the boy if steel and lead started flying? He had fought in battles where survival came down to instinct. But this time instinct had a stretch to cover 3 lives, not one up by midday. They reached a ridge that overlooked a stretch of open ground. From there they saw them. 5 riders moving slowly below, scanning the land with the sharpness of men who meant to finish what they started. The cowboy counted rifles slung across shoulders, pistols at hips, hard faces set in the certainty that no one would challenge them. The boy's breath caught, and he clung tighter to his mother. She reached down, brushing his hair back, her touch steady though her own fear was clear in her eyes. The cowboy crouched low, motioning them into cover behind the ridge. "We stay quiet. Let them pass," he whispered. For a long hour they remained hidden. The riders below picked through the mud, following signs, circling like wolves that could smell blood. One dismounted, knelt to study the ground, then pointed north. Their voices carried faintly upward, too distant to catch every word, but enough to know they believed the trail was fresh. They pushed on, the cowboy's breath released slow, but his shoulders didn't ease. He knew it was only time now. The riders would not give up. They had chosen her death as justice, and his interference had turned it into a challenge to their pride. Men did not let go of pride easily. When the riders finally disappeared beyond the tree-line, the cowboy turned back to the woman and boy. "We can't keep running. They'll follow till we're cornered. We need ground that favors us." The woman frowned. "You mean to fight?" His eyes were steady. "If they force it, yes. I won't let them take you back." Silence stretched heavy. The boy looked between them, fear mixing with trust. The woman's pride warred with the truth of their situation. At last, she gave a short nod, her voice quiet but sure. "Then we stand with you." The cowboy didn't answer, but the decision was made. He led them deeper into the forest until they reached a bend in the land where boulders jutted up from the ground and a narrow trail cut through. He knew the place from scouting years ago. One man with a rifle could hold 5 if he had cover and patience. They settled there. As night crept in, the cowboy worked quickly, showing the boy how to gather stones to block the narrow trail, setting snares with wire, laying branches to break sound under boots. The woman prepared what food they had left, her hands shaking only slightly as she moved. The boy followed every order without complaint, his eyes locked on the cowboy, as though learning was the only way to keep fear away. When the fire burned low, the woman finally spoke. "You risk your life for us. You don't even know me." Her voice was soft, but beneath it was a question that had lingered since he cut her down. Why had he chosen to stay? He looked at her, his face lined with shadows. "I know enough. They left you to die. That's reason enough for me." His words were plain, no gesture to soften them, but she held his gaze longer this time. There was no pity there, only resolve, and she found herself breathing easier because of it. Outside, the forest was silent again, but it was the kind of silence that carried tension, as if the trees themselves waited for what came next. The boy drifted to sleep, his head resting against his mother's side. She sat near the fire, her eyes lingering on the cowboy as he checked his rifle, loaded each round with care, and then sat back against a rock to keep watch. They were no longer running. The choice had been made. If the riders came, they would meet them here. And the cowboy, once a man with no mission but to survive alone, had found his line. He would not let her be taken, not while he still drew breath. The night passed with little rest. The cowboy stayed awake, his rifle across his lap, listening for every shift in the forest. The fire burned low, throwing weak light across the narrow trail they had chosen to defend. The woman sat against a rock, her son curled against her side, both asleep at last. He kept his eyes on them from time to time, their quiet breathing reminding him of what he was guarding. He had stood sentry before, long nights in the war, when silence pressed heavier than any battle. But this was different. Back then he fought because someone told him to. Now, the choice was his alone, like first light. The forest stirred awake with bird calls and the drip of rain falling from pine branches. The cowboy was already on his feet, checking the traps and the stones they had laid across the narrow trail. His boot prints traced the same path again and again, each step measured, his thoughts circling what was to come. 5 riders against 1 man was poor math, but terrain and what could bend the numbers. He had no illusions, though. If it came to it, the fight could take him down before the end. The woman woke slowly, wincing as she pushed herself upright. Her wrists still burned with raw wounds, and her body was sore from days of weakness. Yet her eyes were steady. She looked at the cowboy preparing the ground and finally asked what had lingered unspoken since they stopped here. "If you fall, what becomes of us?" He froze a moment before answering, then looked directly at her. "That's why I won't fall." His tone was harsh, but not cruel, the words spoken like a vow more than comfort. It silenced her doubts, though it didn't ease her fear. The boy woke soon after, and the cowboy put him to work. Together, they carried branches to line the trail, each step crunching deliberately so that if the riders came, their approach would be heard. The boy asked questions. Why place stones here? Why hide there? Why sit so still with a rifle? The cowboy answered in short phrases, teaching without ceremony. He wanted the boy to know enough to survive. Even if the worst came, by midday, the forest fell quiet in a way that wasn't natural. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals. Only the heavy silence that comes when men are near. The cowboy crouched low, eyes narrowing toward the tree. A faint snap of a twig carried on the breeze. Then another. The woman stiffened, pulling her son close. The cowboy motioned them behind the largest boulder, his hand firm but steady. He whispered low to the boy, "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear." The boy nodded, his lips pressed tight, his small body trembling, but his eyes locked on the man who had become his shield. The first rider appeared on the trail, horse stepping cautious, rifle across his chest. Another followed, then three more, fanning out with practiced ease. Their faces were hard, eyes sharp, each man carrying the look of someone who believed what they were doing was right, or at least justified. One called out, his voice carrying up the pass. "You up there? We know you got her. That woman's a thief. Best hand her back before worse comes of it." The cowboy stepped out from behind the rocks, rifle in his hands, but lowered, his broad frame filling the narrow gap. He stood tall, hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the riders. His voice, when it came, was steady, unshaken. "She's not yours to take. Not now. Not ever." The lead rider sneered, spitting into the dirt. "You don't know what she's done. She don't belong here. We gave her judgment, and you cut her loose. That makes you part of it." The cowboy's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his rifle yet. He let the silence stretch, his gaze never leaving theirs. Inside, he weighed his options, the chance of driving them back with words, or the reality that men like these rarely turn away without steel deciding the matter. His past taught him one truth. Once blood was called for, someone always paid. The woman watched from the shadows of the boulder, her hand over her son's mouth to keep him silent. She could see the strain in the cowboy's shoulders, the careful control in his breathing. She realized then what no one had said aloud. He was ready to give his life for them. Even though they had been strangers only days ago, .1 rider urged his horse forward, pistol drawn. That was the moment the cowboy lifted his rifle, the motion smooth, practiced, and final. "That's far enough," he warned. His voice carried no tremor, no hesitation. The standoff stretched, the air thick with the threat of violence. The boy's heart pounded so loud he thought they might hear it. The woman pressed her son tighter, whispering in their own tongue, steady words meant to hold him calm at last. The lead rider barked, "We'll be back. And when we come, you won't stand a chance." With that, he pulled his reins, and the others followed, retreating slowly, their eyes locked on the cowboy until the trees swallowed them whole. The cowboy didn't lower his rifle until the sound of hooves faded. Only then did he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned back to the woman and boy. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes were wide with something close to awe. The woman's gaze met the cowboy's, her pride and fear mixing with something deeper, a quiet recognition that this man had chosen their side fully now. Whatever the cost, he reloaded his rifle with slow, deliberate hands. "They'll come again," he said. His voice was low, heavy with certainty. "And next time, it won't end with words." The fire that night was small, the mood heavy. But under the fear lay a shift that none of them spoke aloud. The woman no longer looked at him as a stranger who had cut her free. The boy no longer saw him as just a passing protector. And the cowboy, though he would not admit it even to himself, no longer thought of them as a burden he had picked up on the trail. They were bound together now, and if the riders came back, as he knew they would, it would be as a family that they faced them. The morning air was cold, sharp with the scent of wet pine and damp earth after the night's rain. The cowboy had not slept again. He stood at the edge of the camp, his rifle balanced across his arm, scanning the tree for the return he knew was coming. His jaw was set, his eyes hollow but focused. He had seen this pattern too many times in war. Men who promised they would be back always kept their word. Pride and cruelty drove them, and pride didn't die easy. The woman rose slowly, adjusting the blanket across her shoulders. She had rested, but only barely. The boy stirred awake beside her, eyes wide the moment he remembered the standoff from the day before. He looked toward the cowboy, his voice small but steady. "They're coming again, aren't they?" The cowboy gave a single nod. He didn't lie to children. "Yes, today or tomorrow." His voice was low even. He crouched to meet the boy's eyes. "When it happens, you stay with your mother. You don't move unless I tell you." The boy swallowed hard, then nodded, pressing his lips together to stop them from trembling. The woman stepped closer, her eyes locked on the cowboy. "We cannot run forever. They will always follow." Her tone was matter of fact, not fearful. She had lived too long with cruelty to believe it could be outrun. The cowboy studied her face, saw the truth of her words, and gave the faintest nod. "Then we make a stand." They spent the day preparing. The cowboy showed the boy how to stack stones to form a wall of cover. He demonstrated how sound carried in the forest, how a snapped twig could betray a man's approach, and how silence could be a weapon. The boy listened with the intensity of someone who knew his life depended on it. The woman gathered what herbs she could find, binding them into poultices. She had no weapon, but she had knowledge of healing, and that, she knew, might matter before the end. As the sun dipped low, the sound came. Hooves, steady and certain, carrying men who knew exactly where they were going. The cowboy moved quickly, pushing the woman and boy behind the stone wall they had built. He took position a few yards ahead, rifle resting on the ridge of a boulder, his revolver holstered at his side. His heartbeat slowed, his body settling into the calm he had known before battle. When death was close, but focused steadier than fear, .5 riders appeared at the bend of the trail, their faces grim, weapons ready. The leader reined in his horse, his voice carrying strong. "Last chance, stranger. Hand her over, and we'll let you walk away." The cowboy's voice cut back, sharp as steel. "She's not yours to take." The leader sneered, spitting into the dirt. "She's a thief. She's nothing." The cowboy's jaw tightened, his voice colder now. "She's a mother. That's worth more than any of you'll ever be." The words struck deep, and anger flashed across the men's faces. The first shot cracked, echoing through the trees. The cowboy fired back, his rifle kicking against his shoulder. One rider toppled from his horse, hitting the ground hard. The others fanned out, returning fire, bullets shattering bark and stone. The woman pulled her son down, covering him with her body as splinters rained from the rocks. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cowboy, her heart pounding at the sight of him standing firm against the storm. The fight was quick, brutal. The cowboy dropped another rider with a clean shot, then shifted to his revolver when the rifle emptied. He moved with the precision of a man who had lived this before, every motion deliberate, efficient. But he was only one man, and the odds pressed hard. A bullet grazed his arm, tearing cloth and flesh. He gritted his teeth, refusing to fall. .1 rider broke through, charging closer. The woman, without thinking, grabbed a stone from the ground and hurled it with all her strength. It struck the man's head, throwing him off balance just enough for the cowboy's shot to finish what she started. The cowboy glanced back at her briefly, eyes meeting hers with something fierce and unspoken. Gratitude, respect, and the realization that this fight was theirs together. When the gunfire ceased, the silence returned heavy and final. 3 men lay still. 2 fled, wounded into the trees, their horses carrying them away in panic. The cowboy stood breathing hard, his arm bleeding, his revolver empty. He lowered it slowly, scanning the ground to be sure it was over. The boy crawled out from behind the stones, rushing to him. "You're hurt," he cried, eyes wide. The cowboy knelt down, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's nothing I can't carry." His voice was steady, though his arm trembled. The woman came forward, tearing cloth from her dress to bind his wound. Her hands were firm, steady despite the blood. She didn't look away from him, and he didn't look away from her. In that moment, no words were needed. The truth was there, plain as the ground beneath their feet. He had chosen them, and she had chosen to stand with him. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the fire was built again. The boy lay against his mother, eyes finally closing in exhausted sleep. The cowboy sat nearby, his arm bound, his rifle beside him. The woman looked across the fire at him, her voice quiet but carrying weight. "You saved us. More than once. I will not forget." He held her gaze, his voice low. "We'll see it through. All of us." For the first time in years, he let himself believe the words. The battle was over, but the air still carried the smell of gunpowder and pine bark torn by bullets. The cowboy sat close to the fire, his sleeve torn and arm bandaged with strips of cloth the woman had bound tightly. The boy lay asleep between them, worn out from fear and exhaustion, his head resting against his mother's lap. She stroked his hair gently, her eyes fixed on the cowboy across the flames. For a long time, neither spoke. The forest around them was quiet again, as if the land itself was settling after the violence. The woman finally broke the silence, her voice low but steady. "Will they come again?" It was the question that had hung heavy since the first moment he cut her free from the rock. The cowboy looked into the fire before answering. "No, not after this. The ones that lived will ride home and tell the others what happened here. They'll have no stomach to chase further." He spoke with the certainty of a man who knew the ways of pride and defeat. She searched his face, weighing the truth of his words. Slowly, her shoulders eased. For the first time since she had been left in the sun to die, she believed the danger might truly be behind them. The cowboy leaned back against the rock wall, his body aching, but his mind clear. He had lived too long with nothing but his own shadow for company. Yet now, as he looked at the boy sleeping safe and the woman watching him with quiet strength, he realized the question that might linger for anyone listening to this story. Would he leave them behind once the danger passed? He answered it to himself in that moment. No, he would not. That be why the next day they moved on, leaving the battleground behind. The cowboy led them north until the trees thinned and a small valley opened before them. In its center stood an abandoned cabin, weathered but still sound, its roof sagging slightly, its door hanging crooked. He stopped at the sight of it, something shifting in his expression. "I knew this place," he said. "Scout station, long ago. No one's claimed it since." The woman studied the cabin, the boy's eyes lighting at the thought of shelter that was not a cave or the open ground. "Can it be ours?" the boy asked eagerly. The cowboy hesitated only a moment before nodding. "If we're willing to work for it." The days that followed were filled with labor, but it was labor that brought life instead of death. The cowboy cut new boards for the door, patched holes in the roof with pine shingles he carved by hand. The boy gathered stones for the hearth and fetched water from the stream nearby. The woman cleaned the cabin, scrubbing the dirt from the floor, sewing blankets from what cloth she had left. She sang softly to her son in her own tongue at night, the words strange but soothing, filling the cabin with a sound that had been missing for too many years. For the first time, the cowboy found himself laughing quietly at the boy's clumsy attempts to chop kindling. He caught himself, surprised at the sound, but he didn't push it away. The woman noticed, her eyes lingering on him, and she smiled faintly, though she said nothing. One evening, as the fire in the cabin burned steady and the boy lay asleep near it, the woman sat across from the cowboy. Her hands rested in her lap, her eyes steady on his. "You could still leave," she said. Her words were not an accusation, but a test of truth. He met her gaze without flinching. "I could, but I won't." His voice carried no hesitation. He looked at her, really looked at her, the pride that no cruelty had broken, the quiet strength that had carried her through shame and suffering, the way her son clung to her with love that no town could strip away. "I was done living for myself alone. That end of the day, I cut you free." Her breath caught slightly, and though she lowered her eyes, the faintest warmth touched her face. She reached across the table, laying her hand lightly over his. His hand, rough and scarred, turned and held hers in return. No words followed. None were needed. When the night deepened, the cowboy stepped outside, the woman beside him. The valley stretched quiet under a sky thick with stars. The boy slept safe in the cabin behind them. The air was cool, and the only sound was the whisper of the wind through the pines. The cowboy looked out across the land, then down at the woman standing close at his side. "This is home now," he said simply. She nodded, her hand brushing his as if to seal the choice. For the first time in years, she was not afraid of tomorrow. And for the first time since burying his wife, he no longer imagined riding off alone into the horizon. They stood there together in silence. Two people who had been broken by cruelty and loss, now bound not by blood but by choice. A woman who had been left to die, a boy who had begged for help, and a man who thought he had nothing left to give. Together, they had carved something stronger than survival, by the firelight in the cabin, by the land that stretched wide and empty around them. They had found what they had been missing. A place to stay, a family to stay for. The story ended not with escape or flight, but with the one thing the cowboy had never let himself hope for again, the decision to remain. And this time, he stayed.